Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 832 of People Behind the Science, where we are rebroadcasting our interview with our guest, Dr. Nick Haddad. Listeners, through his research, Nick searches for the rarest butterflies in the world, and he works to understand what factors are causing the decline of these butterflies and what we can potentially do to conserve them. And in our conversation, Nick shares some outstanding stories from his life, his career, and his research. So let's jump right into this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am excited to speak with our guest scientist, Dr. Nick Haddad. So, Nick, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you with us, and I'm excited to learn more about you and your research. But let me first start by telling our listeners a little bit about you and your background. So listeners, Nick is a professor in integrative biology at Michigan State University and also a senior terrestrial ecologist at the Kellogg Biological Station. In addition, he is author of the recently released book, The Last Butterflies, A Scientist's Quest to Save a Rare and Vanishing Creature. Nick received his bachelor's degree in biology from Stanford University, and he was awarded his PhD in ecology from the University of Georgia. Afterwards, Nick conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Minnesota. And before joining the faculty at Michigan State University, he served on the faculty at North Carolina State University for about 19 years. And in our conversation today, Nick, we're excited to learn more about you as a scientist, but also more about you as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, I like to do electrical and plumbing work. My wife is a historic preservationist, which means she likes to live in and conserve old buildings. It means we've been in homes that are at their newest, built in the 1920s, and now at their oldest in our current home, built in 1840. So you can imagine this means there's a lot of upkeep that needs to be done. Maybe that's an understatement. So among those things is old electrical work and plumbing. So the plumbing might be iron or steel, the old plumbing, or the old electrical might be knob and tube. So there's a lot of repair that needs to be done with that. And what I learned about myself 20 years ago is that I love electrical and plumbing because first, I do it quite well, I will say at this point, but it's also a linear process. So water flows in a linear way and electricity goes in a linear way down lines, electrical wires. So I'm a linear thinker, and so it's easy for me to just connect the dots and make the electrical and plumbing work. I don't know if you or other people listening are familiar with knob and tube wiring, but this is the first generation of wiring where there are two electrical lines, the hot wire that takes the electricity outlets or lights, and then there's the neutral wire, the one that comes back and completes the circuit. Well, now they're all contained in one enclosed wire area. But historically, they were running in two lines that were separated from each other by about a foot. So then you've got these wires just kind of running along. And they're called knob and tube wires because they're connected by ceramic knobs that go down the wood in your house, the joists and studs. Mm-hmm. And then there's tubes that are ceramic that get them through the wood. So I took it on myself to replace all the knob and tube wiring in my house.
Oh, wow.
Partly for fun and partly because insurance companies won't insure the house with that kind of wiring. And it got to be so extensive and complicated that not only did I replace the wires, but I had to replace the whole circuit box. That's that metal area that has all the little switches that get tripped sometimes, and you have to go flip them back on in your basement.
Oh, dear.
But anyway, I view that as a big accomplishment for me.
Well, congratulations. And I'm glad to hear you find this fun, because I'm one of these people who sort of dreads home renovations. I do them, but I don't enjoy them, I will say.
Yeah, people often say, isn't that scary to work with electricity? And I actually find it not scary at all, but it's like once you get this linear thinking in mind, then you know how to make it safe. We'll put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Have you become the go-to person for friends and family to fix all the little things wrong in everyone else's houses?
In some ways, yes, but people also, because I'm an amateur, they get nervous.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, it's great to hear a little bit about what occupies your time when you're not hard at work in the lab, but let's chat a little bit about your science next. Nick, can you tell our listeners who might not be familiar with you or your lab what you do?
So, among other things, I search for the rarest butterflies in the world. So what does that mean? I should give a bit of context. I'm somebody who loves searching for rare things in general. When I was young, I had all sorts of collections, stamps, coins, baseball cards, football cards. So I'm really quite attuned to what rare things are. I know that, for example, 1955 penny could be double stamped and be very valuable, or that the Flying Jenny, which is an airplane in the early 1900s stamp, could be flipped over and be very valuable. So it didn't take me long when I started studying butterflies to start looking for rare butterflies. And more than that, I think not just about my search. I mean, that could seem trivial, but really what I'm thinking about is what factors cause the decline of the rarest butterflies towards really the edge of extinction, and what we can do to conserve rare butterflies and pull them back from the brink. So in the end, that's what I am, as a conservation biologist who wants to see the diversity of life on Earth, including those rarest butterflies, thrive.
Absolutely. And to give our listeners a sense of context, you don't have to travel too far, unfortunately, to find some of these rare species, right? There's some right there in Michigan.
For some reason, I've ended up living in places where there are the very rarest butterflies. So right here in Michigan, we have 3 of the rarest butterflies in the United States. They're all listed on the U.S. Endangered Species Act as endangered, and they are really quite rare. And the interesting thing about the Michigan species is that there's one case, the Carner blue butterfly, that is really in the midst of a nice recovery. And it lives in oak savannas where people have learned how to manage those to see them through to growing population sizes. But there's another butterfly, the power-chic skipperling, which used to live in hundreds of populations from Michigan here to Manitoba and through Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Now it's found in 6 places. In the last 20 years, it's gone from 200 populations to 6.
Oh, wow.
And 4 of those 6 are in southeastern Michigan. I got to see one last year. And frankly, I'm glad I saw it, because this thing's declined so quickly that it's almost hard to see how it can escape extinction.
Certainly. And I think just having this mission to find and conserve some of these really endangered species can be really motivating for you as a scientist. And I love to collect little bits of motivation and inspiration from everybody that we have on our show. So Nick, do you have a particular quote or a saying or a force that really motivates you in the work that you do?
So there's 2 quotes, but they're related. One is that man plans, God laughs. And this is a Yiddish adage that a student gave to me. And I'll tell you the context. I'm a planner. So I often ask my students, what do you see yourself doing in 5 years? And I use that 5-year cutoff because it's typically after an undergraduate degree, after a master's degree, after a PhD. So what is the next step? And I asked a student that question a couple of years ago, what are you going to do after your master's degree? And she kind of rolled her eyes and she said, well, my dad always says, man plans, God laughs. And then that led to a different saying that I saw after that, which is by Winston Churchill. And he said, plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. So why is this important? Well, like I said, I'm a planner, but it's gotten me to step back and think about plans going awry. And that's been true in a few areas, including this work on the rarest butterflies, when my best intentions for conservation has at times sent me in the exact wrong direction.
Certainly. And I think taking that time to make not just a plan, but maybe a plans B, C, and D too is important sometimes in science.
Yes. That's what this saying has gotten me to step back and think about.
Absolutely. Well, great to hear a little bit about what is motivating and inspiring you. And I'd love to take a moment to talk about some of the people who might have come along the way in your life and your career to motivate and inspire you. So, Nick, do you have any role models or mentors who really rise to the top in your mind?
Well, I have a few, but I'll just tell you about one. So this is a person named Gretchen Daly. And she was the first person I met when I decided to become an ecologist and conservation biologist. And actually, the backstory is interesting there, which is that when I decided to become an ecologist at Stanford University, I thought, all right, I want to go interact with the best ecologist, conservation biologist that is here that can be an advisor, mentor. And so whose office did I walk into? The office of Paul Ehrlich.
Oh, wow.
The person who wrote The Population Bomb and other important works. And he immediately said, I could just get the words out that I wanted to work with him. And he said, great, go talk to my graduate student, and sent me down the hallway. And I have to say, I was upset, maybe is the nice way of saying it at the time. Mm-hmm. At the time, I was upset. It turned out he's a mentor, a role model too, but I've told him since that this was the best thing he ever did for me, because he sent me down to the office of his graduate student, Gretchen Daly, and I sat down and she was very encouraging about opportunities that I could have, and it led to a couple research positions. One was in Colorado working with her on her dissertation research project. So we were studying the role of a bird, red-naped sapsucker, and its role in creating nests for other birds. And so it makes holes in the sides of trees, and then it nests there, and then it moves on. Then other birds like chickadees and bluebirds move in. So one of the reasons she became a role model was first in asking great scientific questions, but encouraging me as a undergraduate to seek out my own passions and thinking more critically about my science. But she was also a fun person to be around. We spent times hiking, playing pickup basketball or whatever. So she was a role model both on the professional and personal side. But since then, so this was now 27 years ago that I worked with her as an undergraduate, she's become one of the superstars in ecology and conservation biology. She's literally transformed how not just scientists, but conservation organizations like the big international NGOs, Nature Conservancy and others, how they do conservation. She thinks about conserving nature in a way that also benefits people. So here I am landing in the office of this graduate student who then has become one of the great scientists and conservation biologists of my lifetime.
Oh, this is phenomenal. It sounds like, Nick, you had some really wonderful experiences as an undergraduate student, but I'd love to rewind back even farther and talk about your scientific beginnings, as it were. You mentioned that as a kid, you liked to collect stamps and baseball cards and coins and things like that. Were there other things that you can think of in terms of memories when you first started getting interested in maybe science specifically or ecology?
My best memories of getting into science were my summers spent at my grandparents' farm. And I say farm, they lived on a farm, but the other side to this is that my grandfather was not a farmer. He was an academic biologist, a microbiologist. So I was hearing about biology and science from the earliest age. So there was that academic part, a constant part of discussion, but it was really the farm itself that had the great impact. So the farm was located on an island in the Chesapeake Bay. And the farmland, the property literally wrapped around the edge of the island, was about a mile of shoreline. So I spent my summers there just running around outside with all my cousins, but also out in the water, in shallow water, catching crabs or out on a boat catching fish. But I really remember most catching crabs, where you'd have to walk around in the marshes and with a net and scoop around for crabs. And well, I'm also a competitive person, so of course I wanted to get those crabs. So I just spent a lot of time out in nature, thinking about nature in a way, but really I was thinking about catching crabs. But the one ironic part of catching crabs is I never collected butterflies as a kid. A lot of people do. But I did hold a net. It just wasn't a butterfly net. It was a crab net. So maybe that was the way that I picked up the skills that I needed most in studying butterflies.
So, Nick, how did you then go from catching crabs to becoming interested in butterflies? Can you tell us what are some of these key moments along the way?
That's an interesting one because I never really thought I would become a butterfly biologist. Even when I got into ecology and conservation, I first got into studies with birds. I already told you about one example with the red-naped sapsucker, but another study before that was studying birds in oak woodlands that are surrounded by grasslands and shrublands in California. So I loved birds. I loved thinking about them. I loved studying them. And I thought, I am to go to graduate school to study birds. So I applied to work in labs where people study birds and ended up getting into one of those labs. But my professor in graduate school knew the kinds of questions I wanted to ask and said these would really be easier to answer if you used butterflies as a model system. So that was it. I dove into butterflies, and yes, I've done other things along the way, but my heart still is with those butterflies.
Gotcha. And I mentioned in our introduction that you spent quite a bit of time at North Carolina State University. Can you talk about your research program there and then how you transitioned to Michigan?
So my focus there was almost totally in the southeastern U.S. And I will say that when I was a graduate student, this was now 5 years before I arrived in North Carolina, I had started an experiment in South Carolina. And I one day was offered a job in North Carolina and the next day received a big grant from the National Science Foundation to keep working on this experiment in South Carolina. So there, the work was on how to conserve lands that are being lost or fragmented by people. And again, I was working on butterflies there. So when I arrived in North Carolina, I also became known that I was a butterfly person that was in the lab in North Carolina State University. So then the people in charge of butterfly conservation in the state called me to ask for advice. So the first people that did that were at Fort Bragg Army installation in North Carolina. And it turns out there's a very rare butterfly that's found there and nowhere else in the world.
Oh, wow.
So the story goes beyond that. The butterfly mainly lives in artillery ranges, and it does so because the artillery itself mimics natural disturbances that people have taken out of the landscape, basically fire that naturally would have kept the butterfly's habitats open. Anyway, I got involved there from day one. I thought it would benefit my research as well because their habitats have been lost and fragmented. So instead of an experimental system, it was a real conservation situation. So I dove in there in 2002 and I've been at it for 17 years, but it's like a slippery slope. You get involved in one rare butterfly and then the next person calls you who has another rare butterfly issue and then the next one and the next one. And all of a sudden I have a whole portfolio of rare butterflies that I study.
That is amazing. So then can you tell us how you decided to move from North Carolina up there to Michigan?
So another thread that has cut through my research is that I'm an experimental biologist and ecologist. So all of my research is in large, long-term experiments. As a starting graduate student, I created this experiment with the U.S. Forest Service where I got the Forest Service to harvest forests in experimental patterns where there were areas that were about the size of a city block, areas that are connected to other areas of the same size or that are very isolated from those other areas. And what I was interested in is creating what are called landscape corridors, superhighways for plants and animals that would increase their population persistence and increase the diversity of species. So that experiment was set in place in 1992. It's still going today. Then I started creating experiments to study the rare butterflies. So I experimentally created habitats for those rare butterflies to try to recover populations of these endangered species. And those experiments started in about 2002, been going ever since. So here I am with decades-long studies. And the other interesting thing about them is that they're always couched in basic ecology, conservation biology, but working with people managing the land. So trying to bring together that interface between academic science and applied management to further conservation efforts. So this opportunity came up at Michigan State to become the leader of one of these big long-term experiments. So here at Kellogg Biological Station, we have a long-term ecological research project. Now, that's actually a phrase, the long-term ecological research program of the National Science Foundation. And here we have experimental treatments, again, large treatments that vary land use intensity in agricultural landscapes. So again, there's that very applied part, but I'm interested in the basic science of what we can learn to improve land management for conservation. So this opening came up. Well, I've got the experience of working in long-term experiments. They had this opening to run a program of long-term experiments. And to me, it just seemed like the perfect opportunity to bring my skills to a new leadership opportunity.
Certainly. And I know you have so many cool projects going on there, many of which are unique, as you mentioned, in the fact that they are large and long-term, which is relatively rare in science. So do you have a particular experiment that is your favorite or a project that you're working on that you want to tell me and our listeners in more detail about today?
Let me tell you about the experiment that I'm most excited about this year, and it's been going on for 17 years. Mm-hmm. It's an experiment working with this endangered butterfly, the St. Francis satyr, that's found only at the Fort Bragg Army installation. And this butterfly is one of the rarest butterflies in the world. There are about, we think, 3,000 adult butterflies left on the face of the earth.
Oh, wow.
So 3,000, I don't know if that seems like a big number or a small number, but if you can imagine gathering up all those 3,000 butterflies and then kind of squishing them down into your hands, it would make a size of a small ball. It's a tiny amount of butterfly in the world. So when I got involved with this back in 2002, the butterfly had a low population size and it wasn't doing so well. I was going to come in to recover the butterfly. So I set up experiments to try to mimic natural disturbances that the butterfly needs. And so this butterfly lives in wetlands along streams, and these are grassy wetlands. It eats a grass-like plant called a sedge. And to keep those grassy wetlands open, one of the things that the butterfly needs is beaver that create dams. And then when beavers abandon those dams, the habitat flourishes. Well, beavers are not common on the landscape. They've really been reduced in abundance. So these wetlands grow very quickly to shrubs and trees, and then the butterflies don't do well. So what did my lab do? We basically became a lab full of beaver. We created dams like beavers do. And the way we did this is with a temporary damming system where they're like long inner tubes. So we roll out a 150-foot long inner tube and fill it with water from the stream, creating a dam. Like beavers, we took out the trees and carried them out of the wetlands. Well, we started doing that. And then we got the populations off the ground, and we actually had to seed in individuals into the population by growing butterflies in the greenhouse and releasing them out to these new sites. Well, with our effort, the butterfly population started to grow and grow. And now in the place we restored, there's about 800 butterflies. And I told you there's 3,000 total butterflies in the world. And so through our efforts, we've created 25% of the world's population.
That is amazing.
So what's really excited me in the last year is that not only have we seen the population growing, but when I first got into this work, I was thinking about how to ensure population success so these wetlands occur along streams. And for my whole career, I've worked on this idea of landscape corridors, that is, creating these superhighways for plants or animals. And in this case, the butterflies could move down the streams to get to other wetlands. But there were so few of those wetlands on the landscape that effectively the butterfly was cut off. And if the habitat turned bad, there was no other place for them to go to. Well, we've now figured out how we can create these experimental wetlands in patterns that are along streams where the populations can be connected to each other and help to ensure that the populations thrive.
Very cool. Well, Nick, I'm glad you brought up this story because it shows an important point that there's this complex web of organisms and conditions that are necessary for the recovery of these species. So how do you see this moving forward? Are these things that you mentioned that there's a lot of application in the work that you do and that you're doing experimental sort of patches of wetland now? How does this look in the future?
So there's two parts. One is, and I should really emphasize this point, that I bring the science, but I work with people who manage the land. And if it weren't that team effort, this whole conservation effort would fail. So that's one important thing I've learned over 20 years is that we can't just be scientists telling land managers what to do. Rather, that can be one direction. But the other is the land manager saying, this is what we really need in understanding how to manage and restore land. So this is the kind of science we need. So then how do we go forward? Well, one of the things I've learned about this butterfly, the St. Francis satyr, but other rare butterflies, is this critical role of disturbance. And so I brought up that this butterfly, St. Francis satyr, needs beavers to create dams. Well, butterflies can't swim, so they're not going to do well under ponds. But they and other butterflies also require fire. So what does that mean? Well, fires help to reset vegetation and keep grassy or prairie areas open. And this is often the place where this butterfly lives. It's the place where many of the rare butterflies live. So one of the hard things for conservationists to grapple with, and that includes me, is that these butterflies need disturbance, including in places where they are today. When I started working with this rare butterfly, I thought I'm just going to keep people out of where the butterflies are. I'm just going to let them be. But I also don't want their habitats where they are. I don't want those to be disturbed even by natural forces. So I tried to protect them. But what I found is that the more I tried to protect them, the worse the butterflies did.
Oh, no.
So when I got involved in this research in 2002, there were 10 St. Francis satyr populations. And in 2005, I saw the first population lost. 2007, the second population. 2008, 9, 10, 11, more populations lost to the point where there was one left. So here I was, the conservation biologist, coming in to secure the butterflies, and I was actually presiding over their demise. Really, I was at low in my scientific career, and then I had an epiphany, which is that these butterflies need disturbance. So now we have to reintroduce fire, or we have to reintroduce flooding. And the main message I came away from this is that we have to be willing to kill some rare butterflies to save butterfly populations. And it's not just for this one butterfly, it's for many of the most imperiled butterflies in the country and in the world.
Well, Nick, this sounds like a real catch-22 and sort of an emotional decision that you have to make as you're trying to introduce these disturbances, but not take it too far, right?
Oh, it's terrible. Every time I think about it, it just makes my stomach turn. But on the other hand, we're finding that it's needed and it works here and in other places.
Well, thank you so much for sharing more about this project. And you hinted at some of the challenges that you face in the work that you do, not just in conservation, but specifically with some of these long-term experiments with some of these really rare species. And I know there are so many different kinds of challenges and struggles and failures in science. Do you have another story of struggle or failure that you want to share me and our listeners today, and talk a little bit about how you work through it?
I hate talking about failure, but it does happen. One of the examples that comes to mind, I was a graduate student and I had worked with the Forest Service to create this big experiment testing for the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation, and particularly this idea that I've talked to you about already, which is the role of landscape corridors. By connecting habitats, does it increase the dispersal of plants and animals, in this case butterflies, between those fragments, and then increase the persistence of their populations? Well, I worked as a beginning graduate student. I worked with the Forest Service to harvest maybe 100 acres of forest and to reserve hundreds of acres of land for my experiments. And then beyond that, I focused on this one butterfly called the spicebush swallowtail. So above and beyond getting the Forest Service to do work, I took out herbicide to spray, kill all of its food plants so that I could plant the plants in experimental locations. I grew out butterflies from eggs to adults so I could release butterflies of known ages. This was thousands of butterflies. So I did all this effort. The Forest Service did all this effort. And it turned out it was for the one butterfly that did not use corridors.
Oh, dear.
So I had gone into this whole effort thinking, if I do the experiment right, then any species, plant or animal, including any of these butterflies, should benefit from the corridors I'm creating. And the corridors just did not work. So here I am halfway through graduate school, having done all this work. And I just remember sitting I had a hammock on the porch, just sitting in the hammock, wondering if I should just throw it all in. But that experience really did cause me to step back. And at the time, I was employing 8 undergraduate students to help me do the research. And one of them said, well, Nick, you need to think more broadly than this. You need to think about more species than just the spicebush swallowtail. And because of this one person's comment, I decided, all right, let's pick out a suite of species. And then I stumbled on, well, a few where corridors did matter, including my favorite butterfly, the one that really did make my dissertation, called the common buckeye. And I love the word common in the common buckeye because now I study rare species, but my favorite butterfly is the common buckeye. So corridors did affect its populations, but there's even a bigger message than that, which is now I was faced with butterflies that benefited from these landscape corridors and those that did not. And so really in failing with the one butterfly, it caused me to see more panoramically that some butterflies or some animals and plants would benefit. And so then I had to think about which ones would and which ones would not, and how can we use this as a conservation strategy for species that are really imperiled.
It sounds like this failure worked out in your favor, but I'm curious, when you were sitting there in the hammock trying to decide whether to give up on grad school or not, what really tipped the scales and kept you going?
So you asked me about what is a time of failure, and I really was at a point of failure, but I do have another trait, which is that I am deep down in my heart, I'm an optimist. I even call myself an over-optimist, which is sometimes to my peril because it means that I can be unrealistically optimistic. Mm-hmm. But I think in the end, I was just willing to dig down and see a brighter path forward. But it's always with the support of people around you. I always tell my students, my undergraduates, you're the eyes and ears on the ground. You're out there every day, and your thoughts are as important and valid as every other person's, whether it's a graduate student or a professor. There's no telling who has the best ideas. And so in this case, it was an undergraduate who was a real motivator to see a path through to a dissertation.
Absolutely. Well, Nick, I think it's so important to have that support network for being successful in science. And I love celebrating these successes in science on our show. So we're not just going to talk about the failures and challenges. Do you have a favorite success story, whether it was a big win or a small win, that you want to share with me and our listeners today?
When I think about the successes that I get most excited about, it's successes of people that I interact with, and I will say primarily with students, seeing them move on to gain from their experience in the lab or in their research or in their interactions with me, and see that as a part of their professional journey to find their way. And sometimes it's easy to see that. And by the way, that journey doesn't have to be studying rare butterflies, although I love that. I tell my students that they might love or hate working with these rare butterflies, but maybe some parts of their work in my lab will shape their paths. But even more gratifying is when I hear from people that I don't know so well. And so I teach classes with 200 students, classes in ecology. So these are often to students who have gone through the basic biology curriculum and now kind of go to the next step to explore where they want to be in biology. So just this spring, I got an email from a former student, and when I got the email, I had no idea who this person was. So when I've taught 200 people a year for 19 years, that's 3,800 students. And I can't remember everyone, but this person I never interacted with even. So this was more out of the blue. But the person wrote to say, Nick, I happened to see the work you're doing with rare butterflies, and I wanted to reach out and thank you because your class shaped my entire career trajectory. She said, I came into college thinking I'd be a veterinarian, and yet it was through your class that I saw that there were opportunities to think about animals, but think about the conservation of animals. And so she'd gone on to do a master's degree in biology of pollinators, and then she got a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she works mainly now with endangered mammals, but she also has in her work objectives oversight of a butterfly, the Oregon silverspot, that is endangered. So here's a person who was in my ecology class, who never worked with me on butterflies, and yet because of the class got into conservation and then happened to end up doing work on rare butterflies anyway.
Oh, that's so cool.
That was really gratifying, that when I teach these big classes where the people I might know really well, at least a few of them, but I might know hardly at all. And yet my role as a teacher somehow has an impact.
Well, you'll have to keep an eye out for the student at the next conference you go to, right?
Exactly. I do hope we cross paths.
Oh, that is amazing. And congratulations on having this impact on students. I think it is so important to kind of help shape these careers, because oftentimes, and I myself was sort of guilty of this, I came into undergrad with a very limited knowledge of what my career options were. And it was through these faculty, through these classes I was taking, that I really understood what opportunities were actually out there.
Yeah, I think about my own path. I started as an undergraduate thinking I would be an engineer. And pretty quickly after some advanced math classes, I decided I did not want to go in that direction. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go into economics, and was on that path for a year and then did a summer internship at Merrill Lynch and was working with stock and bond traders and realized pretty quickly I did not want to do that for my life. So I got into biology and thought I would be a molecular biologist, maybe following in my grandfather's footsteps. And I worked with a pharmaceutical company called Genentech and realized I did not want to do that for my life either. And so ended up in field ecology. It was a great decision for me.
I think so. And you've had some great adventures along your career path in ecology, and you narrate some of them in this recently published book that we mentioned in our introduction. So I'd love to chat about that a little bit. Can you tell me and our listeners a little bit about your book?
My book started as my search for the rarest butterflies in the world. So I got involved in a rare butterfly. This is the St. Francis Xavier butterfly at the military base in North Carolina. At the same time, I had a student who got involved in the study of another rare butterfly in North Carolina called the crystal skipper. So the St. Francis Xavier is just at this one military base, and then the crystal skipper is found on sand dunes next to the beach. So this is a stretch of barrier islands in North Carolina that runs from a place called Atlantic Beach to Emerald Isle. It's like a 30-mile-long beach. So its habitat could be 30 miles long and about 50 feet wide, maybe 100 feet wide. So this tiny area, and for most of that tiny area, beach homes have popped up. So it's a much smaller area than that. And she told me, she thinks she's studying the rarest butterfly in the world. And I said earlier that I'm a competitive person. So
got to step up, right?
Yeah, step up and say that I was studying the rarest butterfly. So we went back and forth a little bit. And in the end, she was too good of a debater for me. So I didn't want to lose, of course. So I went off to search for another rare butterfly. And I ended up in the Florida Keys studying a butterfly called the Miami Blue, which is also a very rare butterfly. By the way, I do think I found the rarest butterfly that is populations are really known. Mm-hmm. So in the book, it's really about, with the rarest butterflies, we know about why they've declined to be on the edge of extinction. We know why and how habitat's been lost. And we know not just how that affects the one rare butterflies, but how it affects whole ecosystems and all the plants and animals that live in those ecosystems. But because we know why they've declined, then we also have a good sense for how we can increase their populations again. So what I try to do in the book is tell the stories of the individual butterflies, the stories of the people that are involved in, who are just distraught over their decline, but then are also really pioneers in getting the butterflies to recover. And I try to tie together the threads of what makes conservation successful. So 3 things I've learned about how butterfly conservation can be successful. One is I've learned that we have to know their basic biology. You think, butterfly, it feeds on a plant, and the plant, then if we just conserve that, we'll conserve the butterfly. But it's often more complicated than that. So one of the case studies I love is a butterfly that went extinct. And this is one of the chapters in my book. This is what we're trying to avoid. The butterfly was known to be declining for a century. This was in the UK. It's called the British large blue. And it was declining. And this butterfly, yes, it eats a plant wild time, but it has this other interesting interaction with an ant. Some butterflies are tended by ants. The ants feed off of a secretion called honeydew that the caterpillars provide. But then the ants defend the caterpillars against predators. So that's all known. What was not known 150 years ago is that there's an additional step, which is that the ants drag the caterpillars into their colonies and the butterflies feed on the eggs and larvae of the ants. Now, why that is very complicated. But there was one last step. So then the question is, what keeps the ants in the habitats? And it turned out that what kept the ants in the habitats was that the grass was no more than 3 inches high. You think, God, where in the world, besides in somebody's lawn, is grass only 3 inches high? So it turns out that the habitats need herbivores, things that eat plants, to basically mow off the plants. And historically, those were rabbits that had been eliminated from the landscape. So what did people do when they were worried about conservation? They put up fences to keep out people and to keep out cows. And yet, what was it that was keeping the grass mowed to 3 inches high? Cows. So this crazy example where we had to know about the butterfly's biology, but then also allow this disturbance that seems totally unnatural to allow the butterflies to persist. So then that leads to a second point in the book, which is that we need disturbances to create butterfly habitat. So like the cows, they imposed a disturbance, herbivory. And even though it's not natural, it still was important to the butterfly's biology. Or at Fort Bragg, this butterfly study, the St. Francis Satyr, the artillery in the bomb ranges starts fires, and those fires keep the butterfly's wetlands open. And so there are these weird cases where people cut off those natural disturbances, but then activities of people can actually replicate the disturbances. And so it's always just blown my mind. Maybe that's a bad expression to use, but anyway, blown my mind that artillery can do a better job than people can otherwise maintain the habitats for the butterfly.
That is remarkable. And I believe you mentioned 3 points. Was there another one you wanted to mention?
So the third one is that, and it has to do with this disturbance. So if we disturb habitats like by burning out areas or by flooding areas, then we're inevitably going to kill some butterflies. I already said that. We have to kill some butterflies to protect populations from extinction. But beyond that, the areas that are disturbed, we're going to lose butterflies there. They need to be connected to populations that are not disturbed. So the third key point is that we need an interconnected network of populations so that, yes, there's some areas where butterflies are lost due to disturbance, but then there's this whole other source of butterflies that can then replenish areas where butterflies are lost.
Well, Nick, this is absolutely fascinating, and I'm excited to add your book to our list on our website for our listeners to find there and check out. Are there any other books you'd like to recommend for us that we should add to our list?
I've been on a kick of listening to Audible books recently, so I've got a whole list, but I'll narrow down to one. So as backstory, I'll have to say that I listen to almost no music. Music is not my thing. The music I like tells stories. And so I like musicals. So that's going to narrow into then two possible books. The one I would recommend it, but I'm not going to talk about is Les Miserables, which is my favorite novel of all time that has a great musical. But the one I'm going to recommend right now is the biography of Hamilton. So I got into the story of Hamilton in part because of this musical, right? So a lot of people listening might have listened to the musical. It's a beautifully told story. But what I wanted to know more is, what do the words of this music have to do with reality? Well, this is a 36-hour-long Audible book.
Oh, my goodness.
And yet it kept me gripped to the whole thing because it just enriched so much more than is in the musical itself. And the musical's only a few hours long. So you literally will have to read the whole book to understand what this means. But when you think about, in the U.S., we think about the, quote, founding fathers. And we can have our list of Washington or Jefferson or Adams or Madison or whoever. We can name the people. But those people are interacting constantly in the lifetime of Hamilton or their own lives. They're always crossing paths, and it sometimes seems totally random. Of course, it might be at the Constitutional Convention or big, well-known things in American history, but it might be staying at the same boarding house during the Revolutionary War, or ending up with spouses that are friends with each other and then they kind of meet in those means. It's just uncanny how they meet and re-meet. It just made me realize how small the group of powerful people were, at least as we view them through a historical lens. And then there are other things that come across in the book, like one anecdote. You said science or not science. So there's only one way I could think this connected back to science, which is that Jefferson and Hamilton, well, they ended up being in hard opposition to each other at one point. And yet they are trying to reconcile some important policy for the country. And they do it while walking around the Northeast on a botanical tour. That's kind of all the detail I got from the book. But what were they looking at in the woods? Were they looking at nice flowers or ornamental plants they could plant in their garden, or
butterflies, perhaps? Yeah,
or just science? Were they actually recording new species in an area? Anyway, it's a fascinating book. I recommend all 35 hours, especially the end. The end covers what happened to Aaron Burr, so the guy who shot Hamilton in a duel, and his life after the duel. It kind of spends the rest of his life wandering around, mainly in the western part of the country at that time, that is through the Mississippi River, and then the southwestern part of the country, and got involved in some shady schemes, etc. But he was the villain of the story, and yet he also had this terrible demise afterwards for 30 years.
Well, excellent recommendation. We will add this to our reading list on our website as well. And we mentioned throughout our discussion some of the places you've been for your science. And I think this is something that's remarkable about careers in science, maybe particularly when you're doing field research. So when you think back, Nick, on all the places that your science has taken you, not only in the field, but also for conferences and to meet with collaborators, do you have a favorite place or most memorable travel experience you can share with us today?
Well, I do, but I will just add a note here. When you say, especially as a field ecologist, you should be able to go to the best places in the world. And really, most of my research has been in very hot, southern, open, humid places, like the most miserable places you could imagine being, especially this time of year. But my best place was my actual launch into the study of butterflies. So after my undergraduate, I got an opportunity to go work in Guatemala. So this is in northern Guatemala. People might have heard of the National Park of Tikal, which is the center of the Mayan civilization. But I was sent down there with three things: a tent, a mountain bike to get around tropical forest trails, and a butterfly net. And I was there for 2 years and asked to study butterflies. But the people who sent me down knew I knew literally zero about butterflies. But I've already told you I'm good at collecting things, so I could actually do the job they wanted me to do pretty well, which is to collect butterflies, then send them back to the experts to identify them. And in terms of the best experience, well, I guess it depends on the listener, like what they like to do or don't like to do. But being at a tent in the tropical forest for 2 years, well, it was pretty fun. But I didn't know until I sent back to the experts that I had captured 535 species of butterflies. And even more than that, I found about 5 years later, I was sent an article about the new butterflies I had found. And some of these were butterflies that had only before been found in southern Peru or something, and now we're in Guatemala. But others were new species to science.
Oh, wow.
So I had captured, I think, 3 or 4 new species. But I was reading about one, and it turned out to be not just a new species, but a new genus. So a genus is something very different. Like it could be a lineage of butterfly that is millions of years old. So this was now the only species in its genus. So what does that mean? Well, the ostrich is the only species in its genus, and the emu is the only species in its genus. So this butterfly was as different from other butterflies as ostriches are from emus. And I'm reading about this butterfly. And what am I waiting to read? Like all the details about the shapes of wings or antenna or whatever. That's interesting. But what I really wanted to see, I mean, literally reading on the edge of my seat, was what the name of this butterfly was going to be. So here I am thinking, I captured a new species, not just a new species, a new genus. This thing better have the coolest name.
Right. I'm going to brag about this. Yeah.
And I read on, and the name of the species was Inglorious Mediocris. I am not kidding you. That was the name. The mediocre butterfly. So at first, I think, how could this person do this to me? This name. Mm-hmm. But it was a valid name. It was a small brown butterfly. But there are many small brown butterflies that are more deserving of this name. But it does make a good story, right?
That is phenomenal. So you mentioned you spent 2 years in the middle of nowhere, it sounds like, in Guatemala. Were you by yourself out there?
So I wasn't so far by myself. I was alone in terms of me working with the group I worked with, but I was also in Tikal National Park. So I had a tent that was nearby where there were a couple restaurants for tourists to come through, and tourists were coming through constantly. But every day I would then bike out into the woods, literally into the middle of nowhere. And I have to say, I think about, as I send all my students out with cell phones or other safety things to get around. And I'm not putting that down. I think it is important. But this is in the day when there were no cell phones. It was an hour drive to get to the nearest phone, which was undependable. And I was out in the forest accountable to no one. I mean, then I was invincible, right? When you're young. Now I think, God, how did I make that? And My parents must have just been distraught, but it was a great adventure nonetheless.
You made it through.
I made it through. What didn't kill me made me stronger.
That's right. And I think this maybe goes contrary to what a lot of people imagine in terms of life as a scientist. And we love breaking some of these stereotypes that you see in the media on our program. So do you have another story, Nick, that you can share that shows the human side of science, perhaps through some of these traditions you've experienced in different labs, or just fun or funny memories in the field?
Well, let me tell you about a tradition we have in our lab, which I love. Of course, it's my lab. I have to love it. but labs often have a tradition of weekly lab meetings. So what do you do at a lab meeting? Well, somebody might present on their research results, or we might read a new breaking scientific paper and have a discussion about it. But sometimes that can get old, or there's just nothing like that to talk about in a week. So then we'd cancel that meeting. We'd have a few weeks where we get together to discuss things, and there might be a few weeks or a long time where that didn't happen. And then I realized what was missing in that scenario is that there wasn't the camaraderie of bringing the whole lab together. So I'm a field biologist, right? So we're off in field locations doing our research. So we can go days without seeing each other, or weeks, or really months. So the lab meetings were a way to bring people together, even if we had nothing to discuss. So we decided to have a lab tradition called cookie time. And so the idea is that to every lab meeting, somebody brings cookies that they've made. And if there's no lab meeting about sciencey stuff, then somebody just brought cookies, and it was a way to get together. So that's maybe a more unique thing than a lot of labs, but you asked about funny stories, and there are funny stories that come from this, but one that I tell over and over is about 10 years ago. So lab meetings are typically graduate students and me, but undergraduates occasionally attend. And one time I had an undergraduate who was very confident and also a delightful person to have around. And he jumped in and said, I want to bring cookies to cookie time. One side of his family was Cuban, and he said, I want to bring Cuban spice cookies. And everybody in the lab is excited. Great. Oh, this new thing. We've never had Cuban spice cookies. So the next week comes around, and the student brings Cuban spice cookies. So we pass the cookies around one time, everybody eats one. And then we pass them around again, everybody eats another one. And one of the students says, Bobby, these are great. What is the recipe? Is it a family recipe or something? And he says, well, here's the recipe. I went to the grocery store and I got the boxed cookies of chocolate chip cookie, oatmeal cookie, and sugar cookies. And I just mixed those together in a bowl and made them. And those were the Cuban spice cookies.
That is amazing. Well, I love this tradition of cookie time. I think sweets always bring people around the table, right? It's a good way to gather everybody.
In fact, just this morning, it wasn't even cookie time, and somebody brought in apple crumble. So maybe it's even going to a bigger thing than just the once a week.
Right. Well, this sounds like a wonderful tradition and a way to get people together and keep that connection, even though people are kind of off doing different projects in different parts of the field. And I know you're answering a lot of really big questions there in your laboratory. And we talked today about some of the challenges and the frustrations that maybe keep you from being successful in the projects or being able to answer the questions you want to answer. So Nick, if we took away all of the barriers for you, what is the one question you would want to answer most?
So in the last year or two especially, and people have seen this in the news, the idea of the dramatic decline, not just of butterflies, but of insects. So the New York Times had a headline in their Sunday magazine in the fall called The Insect Apocalypse. And there have been other stories about this. So what is the insect apocalypse? It's about what scientists are finding about the dramatic decline of all insects. Now, one thing I should add here is that what we know about insects is mainly what we know about butterflies. We just know the butterflies best of all insects. So I have a student who just had a paper accepted where he looked at change in butterfly abundances in Ohio. Ohio has this remarkable scheme where they have butterflies collected throughout the state along standard transects. They take notes on abundances of butterflies every week of the year, and they've done it for 20 years. And these are scientists, they're people just interested in butterflies. And he analyzed these data to ask, how are butterfly abundances changing? So he summed up all the butterflies observed per week on individual transects and found that on average, the butterfly populations or abundances are dropping by 2% per year. Now, 2% might not seem like that much, but what that translates to is over 20 years, a decline in over 30% of butterflies. It means if you went out into your garden 20 years ago and saw 100 butterflies, well, today you'd go out and see 70 butterflies.
Oh, wow.
But my student also said, if we're finding this in Ohio, what do we find in similar kinds of studies in the rest of the world? And it turns out there's only 4 similar kinds of studies. The gold standard is one done in the United Kingdom. But every one has found this decline of 2% per year in abundance of butterflies. So then the question is, getting back to your question, like, what would I want to do? I want to know what is the cause of the insect apocalypse. And that's the scary thing. We do not know. What could the factors be? They could be just loss of habitat. Well, that has to be one factor. It could be related to changing climate. But a big change on landscapes that's obvious is changes in use of pesticides. So these are things like herbicides. Think about Roundup Ready crops or crops where you can spray on the herbicide that kills all the other plants, including food plants for the butterflies. So that could be one change. And then there's new classes of pesticides that kill other insects. So there's one group, and it's a long name, but it's neonicotinoids. And these things have severe effects. And of course, they kill the pest insects, but there's no reason they wouldn't have the same effects on other insect species. Those are some potential causes, but we don't know the actual cause. So if I had an unlimited budget, no other restrictions, that is what I would solve. It is one of the grand challenges of current science.
Well, this is a fascinating question and a really important problem to find the answer to soon. It sounds like if we're already losing that rate of 2% per year.
And that's just the butterflies. I mean, if we think about it across all insects, there's no reason that what's happening to butterflies is not happening to all other insects. And those insects are critical to the functioning of our ecosystems, to our cropping systems. And this really can be devastating.
Certainly. Well, thanks so much for sharing one of these big projects that remains undone in the field that you work in. And you've shared so much with us today, but I'd love to ask you for one more thing, Nick, and that is a piece of advice. Is there something that really helped you along your career path that somebody told you that you can share with me and our listeners today?
I'll tell you about the best advice I got. When I was coming out of graduate school, I just worked insane numbers of hours. And I had to finish my dissertation. So I was willing to work whatever, 12-hour days, 14-hour days. And I was young, so I also had the energy to do it, the motivation to finish. But I was going on to my next job. This is called a postdoctoral position. So it's sort of purgatory between graduate school and getting a permanent job. And I was talking to the person who'd be my advisor, and he said, I want you to be working on my lab's work while you're here. I don't want you to be working on the work you did for your dissertation to make publications or applying for new jobs and leaving. I want you to be doing work in my lab. And I said, no problem. I'll work on your lab stuff during the workday, and then I'll work on my other stuff during my own time. And he kind of grimaced when I said that. And he said, Nick, I expect an academic biologist to work about 45 hours a week. He said, if you work less than 35 hours, I think you're lazy. But if you work more than 55 or 60 hours, then I think you're a workaholic who will never get anything done anyway. So it seemed right at the time. And this was from one of the most productive scientists in the world, probably. And I thought, there's no way. There's no way this person can work like a standard workday and be done with it. And yet, when I started working with him, I noticed that he did, and I realized that I really have to take hold of my work life to make the balance for the personal life. And so keeping that work-life balance has just been critical to both my career and to my life in general.
Well, such an important lesson for our listeners out there. Nick, is there any other last message or note of inspiration you want to leave them with at the end of our discussion today?
There's a saying out there about, well, it's not whether you fall, it's just how you get up. So last year, I was in an interview for my own university where they wanted to have a message for students. And they asked, students fail, like, how do you advise them when they're failing and struggling with their work? And what I realized is that, yes, I can be supportive to somebody whose science is failing, but in science itself, and this may be particular to science or maybe not, but we actually do succeed by failing. If we knew the answer to our science right from the outset, then it would not be interesting science. But if we don't know the answer, then at times our science is going to fail, and then that helps us to reorient to succeed. And so I do think there is some value in science, I'll say. I think in other ways this can be true, but in science, I think there is benefit to failing to succeed.
Certainly. I think particularly if you're able to learn important things from those failures, that can be so critical. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for everything you've shared with us on our program. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you. If our listeners want to learn more about you and your work, where should they go or how should they get in touch?
They can go look at my lab's website, which is Nick Haddad Lab, NickHaddadLab, altogether, no spaces, .com. But you're always welcome to email me to Haddad, HADDAD, @kbs.msu.edu.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website. Get in touch with Nick if you have any questions. And Nick, such a pleasure again chatting with you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk.
It was so fun to have you here. And listeners, wonderful to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.